Paul Collier, The Bottom Billion, Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It. Dive into the complexities of the global wealth gap with our summary of Paul Collier's insightful book, The Bottom Billion, Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It. This summary not only explores the stark disparity between the world's wealthiest and poorest nations, but it also discusses why the poorest countries have continually failed to develop and keep up with globalization. Learn about the devastating effects of war, the dangers of high-value natural resources, the unique challenges faced by landlocked nations, and the cycle of political corruption in these countries. Finally, explore possible solutions such as targeted international aid, peacekeeping efforts, and international charters to improve nations' governance.
The difference in developing and poorest nations. The term developing world is often used to describe countries other than the United States or Western Europe, but there are vast discrepancies among these nations. The poorest countries face significantly worse poverty than other developing countries. Life expectancy in the poorest regions is only 50 years, compared to 67 in other developing regions. Additionally, 36% of the population in extremely poor nations suffer long-term malnutrition, while only 20% in the rest of the developing world do. The main reason for this divide is that the poorest nations have not been able to catch up with globalization. Countries like China and India were able to benefit from high-speed industrialization and capital inflow, while the poorest were left behind. As the wealth gap between these nations and the rest of the world widens, it becomes increasingly difficult for the poorest countries to catch up. This is because industrialized countries share access to technological innovations while the poorest countries don't have enough industry to keep up. Therefore, while other nations continue to develop, the poorest countries remain stagnant. Devastating effects of war on the economy. War brings about disastrous economic consequences, costing billions of dollars and leading to humanitarian crises. Poor countries are more likely to endure prolonged conflicts due to the strong correlation between poverty, growth, and war. Conflict often arises from economic stagnation, hurting income and leading to civil unrest. Wars brought by poverty further ruin the economy, reproducing the conditions for more conflict. This cycle of bloodshed leaves poor countries with little peace in the first decade after the conflict. Violent conflict disrupts all means of production, and all legitimate ways of producing revenue are commandeered for military concerns. This prevents goods from reaching the market and thus limits growth. Food commodities are either stolen from or donated by farmers during times of war, further harming the nation's economic growth. War's disastrous effects keep the poorest nations poor. The paradox of natural resources. Discovering high-value natural resources may seem like a boon for a country's economy, but the reality is much more complicated. A phenomenon called Dutch disease can occur, causing the newly discovered resource to hurt a country's other exports. This can make the economy stagnant and lead to corruption among politicians. In poorly transparent governments, excess revenue can be diverted into the hands of a few corrupt politicians, who can then create a system that favors them. Once a culture of corruption is established, it can infect other sectors beyond the commodity revenues. In essence, the discovery of natural resources can harm more than help a country's economic self-determination. The challenges of landlocked nations. Landlocked nations face limited poverty alleviation strategies due to their chained economic fate to neighbors with poor infrastructures. When landlocked countries grow by 1%, their landlocked neighbors' economies grow on average by 0.7%, while the poorest landlocked nations enjoy only a 0.2% growth for every 1% gained by their neighbors. The poor landlocked countries' little industry makes them heavily dependent on their neighbors' transportation infrastructure, which is often underdeveloped due to extreme poverty. The absence of reliable transport corridors increases shipping costs and slows growth. Landlocked nations can lobby for aid and improvements to transport corridors to lower transport costs, which helps to stimulate growth. Another possibility for these countries is to avoid being airlocked by developing high-quality airports. Though being landlocked does not guarantee poverty, it doesn't offer any advantages either, and the fate of these countries depends heavily on their neighbors' fates. The high cost of corruption. Corruption thrives in societies with minimal or dysfunctional governments, where unchecked access to resources and aid is combined with extreme poverty. In countries like Chad, where there are poor checks on government and little scrutiny of public finances, corruption is rampant. Breaking the cycle of corruption is difficult, as politicians entrenched in corruption have little incentive to campaign for reform. Unfortunately, the longer a leader remains in charge in a failing state, the less likely the country is to make an economic turnaround. The high cost of corruption is evident in cases like the rural aid clinics in Chad, where only 1% of the allocated money actually made it to those in need while the rest was stolen. To combat corruption, governments must establish systems of checks and balances, ensure transparency, and hold fair elections to limit the ways corruption can damage societies. Reimagining the distribution of financial aid. Financial aid is a popular means of transferring wealth from wealthier to poorer countries. However, as the aid is distributed via often corrupt governments, huge chunks of the fund never reach the intended population. Around 40% of the total military budget of Africa is funded by aid. An internationally run independent service authority can provide government services such as education and medical care without being accountable to a corrupt government. It would be competent, unbiased, and trustworthy, ensuring aid reaches those in need. Such an authority could serve as a benchmark for proper government function, leading to accountability in future governments, thus creating a sustainable system. The power of foreign military in peacekeeping. The presence of international peacekeeping forces can help maintain peace after a conflict by limiting the power of domestic armies and preventing governments from sabotaging the peace process. By acting as an independent and neutral source of power, foreign militaries deter warring parties from resuming violence. This gives post-conflict nations an opportunity to allocate funds towards rebuilding and stabilizing the country instead of rebuilding the military. However, this strategy only works if the foreign military is committed to standing up to demagogues. The French military in Ivory Coast did not intervene in a coup that led to an autocrat because they did not want to draw blood. The author suggests that, in such cases, foreign militaries need to be ready to intervene to prevent a situation from getting out of hand. Overall, the presence of committed foreign militaries can prevent conflict, protect against coups and rebellion, and create the conditions for lasting peace in post-conflict countries. International norms and poverty reduction. Wealthy countries hold immense power in establishing trade norms, which they can use to encourage positive changes in the governance of poorer nations. International norms, when used in conjunction with other tools for development, are powerful weapons against poverty. In the world of economic power, wealthy Western nations dominate and establish trade norms that the rest of the world must adhere to. This immense power can be used to help the poorest regions rise out of poverty. An effective way of doing this is by using international charters, which are collections of rules governing trade. Wealthier nations could establish charters that encourage positive changes in governance of poorer nations. For instance, an international charter for natural resource revenues that mandates countries to allow only companies that have won free and open tender bids to mine their resources could reduce corruption and wastage of natural resources. However, corrupt politicians are known to resist charters. To address this, countries that adhere to charters could receive preferential treatment over those that don't. For example, joining the European Union provides a nation with huge benefits such as a huge free market. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, can use adherence to norms as prerequisites for receiving aid. This strategy ensures that countries adhere to international norms to receive aid. Ultimately, international norms are powerful tools in reducing poverty when used in conjunction with other development tools.
In The Bottom Billion, Paul Collier highlights the multidimensional complexities causing the poorest nations to struggle and fall behind in terms of development, globalization, and wealth. In this illuminating summary, we have explored various factors contributing to this issue, such as violent conflicts, resource curses, political corruption, and geographical disadvantages. Additionally, we have discussed potential interventions, including strategic financial aid, international peacekeeping, and the enforcement of trade and governance norms through international charters. By understanding these challenges and potential solutions, we can strive towards creating a better, more equitable world, addressing the needs of the struggling bottom billion, and setting them on a path towards progress and prosperity.